Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share a quick preview for the Sony RX100 Mark VI. Now, as you can see, I don't have the camera yet, and that's because it hasn't been officially released. It will not be until July 10th of this year, that is 2018. Priced at a hair under $1,200 US. It is by far and away the most expensive point-and-shoot camera that Sony has ever made in the RX lineup. Of course, I mean the RX100, because here, as you may have noticed, I've got the RX10 Mark IV next to the RX100 Mark V. And the reason I have these two cameras together is because I've done a lot of videos about both of these cameras, and they're both really great photographic and video tools in their own right. One being pocketable, giving you limited but a very fast piece of Carl Zeiss glass matched with a fantastic 1-inch sensor, as all of the RX100 cameras have been. 4K video capture, only up to 5 minutes, but still more than palatable for what this form factor has to offer. A fully articulating display that allows you to record as well as take still images of yourself, so great for vlogging. Again, the 4K video limitations in terms of time, not so great. Some overheating issues, but that's to be expected with a camera of this size. But then you've got, the RX10 Mark IV, which pretty much throws all of that out of the window. Now, it does not have, obviously, an articulating screen of the same nature, blocked by the OLED EVF, but still some best-in-class features. No other bridge camera style or style of camera like this on the market. Same 1-inch sensor, same autofocus prowess. Both of these have fantastic autofocus, and that brings me to the RX100 Mark VI. And that is because with the Mark VI, you now have the same form factor of the Mark V, but with the added telephoto reach that we used to have in the RX10 lineup. Now, of course, the Mark IV, 600mm equivalent. But with the Mark VI, you're going to have in the RX100 a 200mm reach. Now, classically, historically, the RX100 lineup has been limited to anywhere from, basically a 75mm reach. Now we're all of a sudden going to have 200mm, something that's more reminiscent of what Panasonic has been doing now for several years with their compact ZS lineup. The 200, the most recent launch, I think has a 386mm reach with a 1-inch sensor, but of course it's missing a lot of the features that this camera has built in, as well as the branding prowess as well. Sony really brought the point-and-shoot camera back into style with the RX100. But again, the reason I have it next to the RX10 is because even though this RX10 model has an incredibly long reach, its predecessors did not. If we go back to the original RX10, it was a 200mm lens. Of course, it was a fast piece of glass, f2.8 throughout the entire 200mm reach from wide to telephoto. That is not something we're going to have with the new RX100. It will have a variable aperture when it comes to that 200mm zoom, but we're getting very close to seeing that original RX10 in many ways now in the RX100, which I think is a fantastic offering from Sony. Now, when it comes to its actual still and video capability, much of that has stayed the same. That also applies to its autofocus capabilities. So you're not getting really anything new in regard to the autofocus capability with the RX100 Mark VI. It's all about that extended telephoto lens. Now, you're no longer going to have that f1.8 that you have here with the Mark V, but again, that's at the trade-off of having a telephoto option that never existed in the RX100 world. That was something you had to lean on an RX10 for, and of course the first couple of generations did not have this reach. This reach did not come out until Mark III, which is when finally Sony said, hey, we're going to make this a little bit more about telephoto. And then of course here in Mark IV, they added a far superior autofocus, a hybrid, autofocus system that simply didn't exist. We were leaning on contrast, not phase detection, up until this gen. And the same applies to this camera. Until the RX100 Mark V, we didn't have a hybrid autofocus system built in. So in many ways, the RX100 Mark VI is taking the best of both of these, pairing them into one much more compact, obviously, RX100-like body. And this does not in any way throw away what Sony has done with the RX100 lineup in the past. So if you still desire to have that f1.8 constant, you can still go ahead and pick up a Mark V. You can also, of course, still pick up a Mark IV, a Mark III. None of these have been phased out, and for very good reason. They all represent different price points and different offerings for Sony when it comes to the consumer that they're really trying to please. So if you don't care about 4K video and you only care about still, of course you can go back to an older generation RX100 that doesn't support 4K video and doesn't have all of the latest and greatest features that the Mark V or the Mark VI will now have. But the Mark VI is really all about the video, the 4K HDR, and most importantly, that telephoto reach being matched with the hybrid autofocus system that the RX100 Mark V introduced. So I see it much more of a video-centric RX100 now that it has a lot more telephoto reach. I see it as a more versatile photographic tool coming out of the pocket. But then again, if aperture is where your heart is truly at, then you're going to want to stick to the Mark V or the Mark IV in order to maintain that constant speed throughout the entire range of the lens, as best as possible is what I should say. If that isn't your priority and you were waiting, like myself, for something a little bit more flexible, pocketable, something that would answer what Panasonic has been rolling out, but do so hopefully with an even better feature set, then that's exactly what the RX100 Mark VI is all about. So don't mistake this in any way. The RX100 Mark VI is not really the culmination of both of these, even though I mentioned it is somewhat of a marriage of the feature set because now we have telephoto. It's really also just an indication of Sony giving a telephoto option to the RX100 lineup, just as they did with the RX10 lineup, where 200 millimeters wasn't really satisfying the telephoto options that a lot of other users had. And that's exactly why Sony brought it to the table in the RX10. That's exactly why they're bringing it to the table with the RX100. So for whatever the RX100 Mark VI sacrifices, of course, you can always fall back on the Mark V or Mark IV. In terms of comparing it to Panasonic's offerings, until I actually have it in hand, which will probably be around the retail launch July 10th, I can't give you more than what we already know, which is that we're still working with the same battery type, the same feature set, but of course, we've now paired that autofocus system from the Mark V with a more versatile telephoto fixed lens, which to me is a great offering, but again, doesn't replace the Mark V. It complements it so that if a consumer really wants that reach, they can buy it. If they don't, they can always default back to the Mark V or Mark IV. I'm also hoping for better 4K video capability with that HDR branding, but we'll see. Until I have my hands on it, I'm not going to tell you anything I don't know. That's never been my policy, obviously. Also bear in mind, I'm not calling this a real, transition that, eliminates the RX10, because the RX10 has so many more features. It's a bridge camera. It's designed to offer you inputs and outputs that simply do not live on the RX100 model for obvious reasons. It's a far smaller camera. You also have a larger battery that's going to give you better battery yield in the RX10 point-and-shoot world, which does not exist in the RX100. I do wish Sony would have introduced a new battery type for the RX100 with this larger zoom range that we have now with the RX100 VI about to launch next month. But we can't have it all in one shot, can we? Either way, it looks like a great camera. Yes, $1,200 US is a steep price for a point-and-shoot camera, but hasn't that always been the story with the RX100 line? And in spite of how expensive Sony has continued to make the RX100, they haven't had any problem selling it, and that's proven by the fact that they continue to make new ones every year. If they had a problem with pricing, you would see resale value on older models really bottom out, which hasn't happened either. The RX100 Mark IV still sells for around $800. The Mark III still sells for around, I think, $650. You get the picture here. As expensive as these cameras are at launch, they hold their value because they still are number one and pretty much unmatched other than Panasonic's offerings, which are good, but not quite up to snuff in my book and experience personally, since I have used Pani comparable cameras. So as a result, Sony still holds the stronghold, so to speak, in this sector, and I don't see that changing now with the introduction of the RX100 Mark VI. I see that only becoming firmer. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Hit that like button. And as usual, please feel free to subscribe. Later.